fundamental assumption, and we are actually funding terrorists in the first place. This is something that the affirmative team has to prove in order to show any warrant for their case whatsoever. Even if the affirmative team can completely prove that Hezbollah is in complete control of Lebanon, that doesn't actually matter until they prove we are directly funding terrorists. I'd like to give you 2 reasons today why we believe that the negative team deserves your ballot when it comes to upholding U.S. interests. The first reason is not funding terrorists. Status quo does not fund terrorists. Now, looking specifically at the evidence the negative team, or excuse me, the affirmative team has provided in today's debate round to actually prove this point, it is found pretty lacking. What we see from the affirmative team were 3 examples of where U.S. aid was being used for terrorist means and funding terrorists. But none of these examples actually mentioned U.S. aid. I brought up those evidence specifically with me today just to make sure I didn't make the same mistake as last time, and I looked at the evidence and none of it actually directly says that Lebanon armed forces were using this aid directly from the United States and giving it to Hezbollah. It talked about how tanks were fighting side by side from the LAF and Hezbollah, but this doesn't show that the LAF is actually funding Hezbollah. It talked about how missiles were being used from Hezbollah, but this was the example that they read in the 1AC, about how missiles were being smuggled through the airport. This doesn't actively show how the LAF is actively supporting Hezbollah and how we are actually funding terrorism. None of this has gone to show the affirmative team's fundamental goal, that we are actually funding terrorism in today's debate round. And for this reason alone, a negative ballot is warranted. But there are a couple of other reasons too why we believe that the affirmative team has not fulfilled their burden and why they do not provide any tangible advantages. Our second voting issue is no solution. No solution. Yes, ideally, the situation in Lebanon wouldn't look like the status quo, but ideally it would also not look like the affirmative team's plan. What we don't see from the affirmative team is any sort of tangible advantage whatsoever. Now, Josiah actually responded in his last speech to a couple of different points, but I'd like to reiterate the advantages of the status quo, and the first is accountability. I talked about in my last speech about how end-use monitoring, or how the Lebanese armed forces use aid given by the United States government, is higher than any other country. His response was first that this is actually not tracking what the LAF uses these weapons for, and secondly, that Congress actually condemns these statements. Now, my first response actually is yes, it does track what these weapons are used for. The evidence I just read to you in my last speech said that it makes the end-use monitoring makes sure that the LAF uses weapons for their intended use, and the affirmative team can see that evidence if they would like to. The second response is speculation. Well, yes, maybe the Congress people believe that the LAF is less effective, but it doesn't actually prove that. This is simply a quote from people who are involved within Congress. This does not support the affirmative team's case. Now, the next argument had to do with how terrorists are, the terrorists that were countered by the LAF were Hezbollah's enemy. Now, first off, I'd like to note this actually does show that the LAF, they agreed that the LAF is countering terrorism. So my first response is countering terrorism. LAF has been shown to counter terrorism. My second response is no proof. To argue that the terrorists that the LAF countered were only attacked because they were Hezbollah's enemy, they needed to provide any sort of evidence to back this up, but they didn't in their last speech. My second response is no impact. Even if they can prove those terrorists were enemies of the Hezbollah, and so that's why the LAF attacked them, this doesn't actually matter. This shows how the LAF has been actively countering terrorism, and they have not shown how this is only for the Hezbollah's interests, not U.S. interests. Now, the negative team argued that we can't lose influence, or excuse me, the affirmative team argued that we can't lose influence because we already lost it. Now, my first response is no proof. The evidence they provided to back this up didn't actually say what they wanted it to say. Now, my second response is yes, we can lose influence, and the affirmative team's plan does that. Now, the negative team also argued that, the aid's purpose is no longer being used properly. Now, remember when I actually talked about the microphone and how I had to lower the microphone in order to fit my unfortunately short height? Unfortunately, the affirmative team talks about, yes, the aid's purpose has been failed in the status quo. This is no reason to remove the aid. My next point under the actual lack of solution from the affirmative team's case is disadvantages. The affirmative team dropped the disadvantages that we talked about in the last few speeches, about how the affirmative team actually empowers Hezbollah and actually allows Russia to take control when it comes to allowing Hezbollah to continue. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter that Russia has less effective weapons if these are the only weapons that Lebanon will be using. This doesn't matter in today's round. What we do see from the affirmative team is no guarantee of any sort of tangible advantage and no proof that we are actually funding terrorists in this